Hi, and welcome to the When Women Fly podcast. Each episode, I have poignant conversations with women who fly, run, surf, ski, climb, or otherwise soar, and possess a passion for life that is infectious. These are honest and insightful conversations about dreams and reinvention, often in the face of uncertainty, doubt, or other impediments. We talk about busting paradigms, grit, working hard, and playing hard, all while building a community around the empowering metaphor of flight. I am your host, Sylvia Winter, a pilot, runner, mother, skier, list maker, and apparently podcaster. I believe that when we share our stories, own our fears, and dismantle our perceived limitations, the possibilities are boundless. Whether you're pursuing your passion or simply love the idea of possibility and wonder, this podcast is for you. Thank you so much for joining me today. Let's get started. Oh, hey, this is the When Women Fly podcast, and I am your host, Sylvia Winter. On this episode, to mark the end of 2020, I will pull back the curtain and share with you some thoughts around this podcast project. I want to first acknowledge that what we have lived through in 2020 has been rife with complexities and at times has been an enormous challenge to stitch together. So, as we are nearing the end of this interminable year, the longest night of the year has passed in the Northern Hemisphere, and the long days of darkness, or any day in this pandemic, are behind us. The moon is full tonight and casting shadows, so there is light where there was once darkness. I love how the full moon offers little to debate. It is predictable, awesome, and brings light. When everything else seems out of control, I gaze at the night sky. The passing of time has been hard to measure except by the moon bulging and shrinking, the season and the weather that has given order to chaos for me. Marking the new year looks different and perhaps calls for more reflection than ever. What does that have to do with the When Women Fly podcast? Why is reflection on chaos and order, pragmatism and intuition relevant to a podcast about women finding flight, freedom, and busting paradigms? Brené Brown talks about a skill set of holding the tension of opposites. For people who can do that, hold the discomfort of paradox, she suggests a truly transformative opportunity. This requires a level of comfort with ambiguity, holding the tension of duality, straddling the tension of opposites, and forcing a transformation within the duality. So here we are, the brink of 2021. And in terms of the When Women Fly podcast, I pause the weekly interview episodes for the sake of creating space and offering reflection. As we sit in paradoxes and ambiguities of life, how can we not be paralyzed by them? This year has magnified the good, the bad, and the ugly in nearly every dimension of life. I am not armed with sage advice or nauseous nuggets of wisdom, but rather I hope to offer you a moment and the permission to take the space to simply acknowledge the dualities alongside the relentless quality of time passing. As someone who deeply values what is gained in sharing stories, the glimpses of windows and mirrors into universal truths and differences, I quote one of my favorite authors, Diane Ackerman. It began in mystery and will end in mystery. But what a savage and beautiful country lies in between. She learned to fly and wrote one of her early books about it using flying as a metaphor for life's journey. She says, I don't want to be a passenger in my own life. At some point during the summer of 2020, our COVID summer that none of us will forget, I told my husband I was going to start a podcast to tell stories, to tell untold stories of women who shared a spirit of flight, metaphorically and literally. I think by making this semi-public statement, I heard myself commit to the initial idea, and then I was accountable. But even if I hadn't, it was evident to me that I had to address this topic, and I wouldn't let my perfectionism sabotage the experiment. To lift the bonnet here, since I purposefully don't talk much about myself in this podcast, I am not a journalist or a feminist or an Olympian or many other things, but I am insatiably curious about other people and places around me, and an empath. My background is actually in the creative field. My graduate work and teaching career is in landscape architecture and design studies. I have morphed my professional trajectory as it responded to life's changes, marriage, moves, 1, 2, 3 children, living abroad and then back again. But COVID brought me back to my essential passions, the human and nature interaction, another duality. In March, when COVID shut down the world around us, I doubled down on my yoga practice and ran a lot of miles. I finished my yoga teacher certification training, and sure, I learned a lot about yoga, but my real takeaway was a drive to practice things in life off the mat that were challenging and revealing, energetic and risky. A venture into new iterations and flux. It was not linear. In a short time, I seriously looked into the fields of public health, mindfulness and education, and diversity of design in public spaces. These were all avenues that would address the current issues, and with the ideal of making the world around us a more responsive and healthy place, in spite of the messy problems. As a landscape architect and designer, we study form and use our idealism and endless curiosity about the way people move through space to build environments that improve and augment the lives, hopefully, of people and the environment. This work will always be important to me. The core pursuit of investigating the way environments affect people and the act of constructing tactile and literal spaces all around us is vital. But the way environments inform people can also be investigated as a cultural pursuit. How does our culture affect who we are, and how can we actually give feedback, reverse engineer, and shape culture? Perhaps that is bold, but I am unapologetic if it is. The reward would be great. But I digress. The point here is that I had no reason to believe that I had any chance of successfully launching a podcast. No previous broadcasting or journalism skills, no experience in sound media, or really social media. But I am an idealist, and I have access to people. And if not me, then who? I am a pilot and a landscape architect, a designer and a mom, a runner and a skier. I have traveled and explored far reaches of the globe. So why not? Media tells us every day what is important by the stories they choose and where they place them. It is called agenda setting, and I wanted to be part of it. When I fly small airplanes, I'm humbled by the pragmatism and intuition required to be a good pilot. This duality is a common thread across the podcast. What duality and paradox, what both and approach is required to get off the ground, to run free, to reach goals? The hard shell and the soft center in Nikki Stone's turtle metaphor in episode 3, or the determined and persistent alongside the intuitive and resilient of Lee Coates in episode 10. There are countless examples of multiple approaches where the interplay of hard work and grit and vulnerability and openness are the secrets. This is how one must fly, with proficiency and a plan, but also armed with openness and an awareness of dynamic situations around us. We call it situational awareness in aviation. When we take literally and figuratively to the sky, to a place of freedom, and speak about the experience, we reveal possibilities. This podcast is a community stitched together by an amalgam, a layering of conversations and ideas. We talk, we riff off each other, and share in the challenges and joys of navigating and landing, taking off and flying level, emergency descents and recoveries, all metaphors that speak to an ode to flying and the spirit of flight. I want to take a moment here for one final thought to leave you with, and then a couple of my favorite assets to share with you that are inspiring me right now. But first, that final thought. Over the last few months, I have gotten into very interesting conversations with earnest people who say to me about the When Women Fly podcast, Sylvia, these are great stories, but how are you going to keep getting amazing guests? Are you talking to the exceptions? Now, my first response reflects my dogged determination, and I admit quickly that doing the hard work is part of the game. But as quickly as I observe my reaction and slight defensiveness, I sense there is more, and I pause. Really? Really? Have you really just asked me if there are enough brave, ambitious, adaptive, and noteworthy women in the world with untold stories that share a spirit of flight, of freedom, of being determined by the process of trying, failing, and growth and resilience? Enough women out there for me to do 52 interviews a year for this weekly podcast? Where have we gone wrong? So, yes, these women are phenomenal and wise and generous. But are they exceptions? Really? Exceptions to what? Exceptions to some preconceived notions about what women can do, will do, want to do, and are able to do? For exceptions, there are a lot of them, and they're important. We have a trove of untold stories. We do not need to give women voices. We have voices. We need to provide platforms and support each other so as not to be dismissed or gaslit as exceptions or aberrations to be ignored. And finally, why not profile the exceptional, unheard of, remarkable, unprecedented, unusual? Why wouldn't we celebrate and elevate these envoys, changemakers, and brave souls rather than overlook them? Each of the podcast episodes reveals something complex and wholehearted about the lives of the humans who have been remarkable, but at the same time, the stories are incredibly accessible and honest. Elizabeth Lesser, an author and co-founder of the Omega Institute, released her latest book in September, just as I was pulling in my first guests and designing this podcast. The coincidence of her latest book, released in September, Cassandra Speaks, and the start of this podcast is wonderfully unexpected and indicated to me the movement I was part of and humbly channeling. Cassandra Speaks. When women are the storytellers, the human story changes. This book by Elizabeth Lesser has so much to offer us. Here I quote a description of her new book. What story would Eve have told about picking the apple? Why is Pandora blamed for opening the box? And what about the fate of Cassandra, who was blessed with knowing the future, but cursed so that no one believed her? What if women had been the storytellers? Elizabeth Lesser believes that if women's stories had been equally heard and respected throughout history, humankind would have followed different hero myths and guiding stories. Stories that value caretaking, champion compassion, and elevate communication over vengeance and violence. Cassandra Speaks is about the stories we tell and how those stories become the culture. It is about the stories we still blindly cling to and the ones that cling to us. The origin tales, the guiding myths, the religious parables, the literature and films and fairy tales, all passed down through the centuries about men and women, power and sex, war and love, and the values we live by. Stories written mostly by men with lessons and laws for all humanity. We have outgrown so many of them, and still they endure. This book is about what happens when women are the storytellers too, when we speak from our authentic voices, when we flex our values, when we become the protagonists in the tales we tell about what it means to be human. Okay, so lots to think about. My final thoughts. As I mentioned, I wanted to share three assets, three and things that are inspiring me particularly right now as we turn 2020 into 2021. First, of course, Cassandra Speaks by Elizabeth Lesser. Second, a TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie, The Danger of a Single Story. She warns that if we hear only a single story about another person, we risk a critical misunderstanding. And third, Brené Brown. Oh, just an evergreen, durable favorite of mine for her thoughtful and moving work on shame and vulnerability. You can find her books, The Gift of Imperfection, Braving the Wilderness, Daring Greatly, The Power of Vulnerability, Men, Women, and Worthiness, and her podcast, Unlocking Us. So those are just a few things that are inspiring me right now, and I will put links in my show notes to all of this. I hope that you'll enjoy returning to previous episodes of the When Women Fly podcast from 2020, and I'm equally excited to take you on a dive into new episodes over the next few months. The When Women Fly podcast is a celebration of female courage, self-discovery, and self-resilience. We invite you more than anything to explore your own world and our world in your own terms. Okay, so that's a wrap. The When Women Fly podcast will move ahead with weekly episodes releasing on Thursday mornings in 2021. You can find out more about the podcast community on the website whenwomenfly.com. And email me with questions, comments, ideas at hello@whenwomenfly.com. If this episode or any episode sparks a light in you, share it. Happy New Year. Cheers.